Hello, everybody. Good evening and welcome to In the Fullness of Time, an event with Paul Bradbury and Andrew Rumsey. They're both going to be speaking to us this evening about the church in this country, past, present and future. Just to explain to you a little bit about the structure of this evening, Paul and Andrew will be in conversation. They will also share some extracts from the book. And at the end, there'll be a time for questions and answers. So please do log in and share any questions you might have in the comment box. If you're looking on a PC, I think that will be in the top right-hand corner. On a phone, you might have to scroll down. Anyway, without any further ado, I will pass you to Paul and Andrew.
Wonderful. Thank you, Josie. Good evening, everybody. How lovely to be with you for the launch of this wonderful book, In the Fullness of Time. And my name's Andrew Rumsey. I'm one of the bishops in the Diocese of Salisbury, the part of the church where Paul lives and serves. And it's my great pleasure to introduce him to you this evening. And Paul is an ordained pioneer minister in the Church of England, based in Poole in Dorset, glorious bit of the country. He's the founder of Poole Missional Communities, which plays host to a number of new forms of church and pioneer initiatives. He's also studying for a doctorate with the University of Roehampton, exploring some of these themes of ecclesiology. He's published 2 books. 5 years ago or so, Home by Another Route, Paul, with the Bible Reading Fellowship, and of course the book that we're here to discuss this evening, In the Fullness of Time. Paul grew up in Dorset and knows the county well. He is someone who enjoys an active lifestyle around ministry. He runs, enjoys bird watching, I gather brewing too, and foraging. Paul, what do you forage?
Mainly mushrooms, actually. Yeah, and it's peak mushroom season at the moment. So yeah, this is the time of year when it's everybody is heading out to the woods and fields if you're that way inclined to gather mushrooms. Yeah,
fantastic. It's lovely to be in conversation with you this evening, and we'll get things underway, friends, and there'll be an opportunity for your own reflections and questions in the last part of this hour. And but Paul, it'd be lovely just to hear a little bit about your thinking behind the book. It's such a fluent and thoughtful work. Thank you, first of all, for writing it. It's timely too, and time is obviously a central theme for your writing here. And I love what you say about time being certainly in the Christian understanding of eternity, not something that is running out, but you urge for a much fuller understanding of time. And I wonder if we might start there, because it seems to me that the how can I put it, the church isn't always the most non-anxious of institutions around time, partly. And was your desire for this kind of patient and progressive, really, approach to mission, was that in some sense the spur for writing it, or what kind of welled up to cause you to do so?
I think, yeah, a whole host of things, really. I think, definitely anxiety, or the perceived anxiety within the church was part of it. I think we're all conscious of the reality of decline, and I think after COVID, well, we are after COVID, but through COVID and the aftermath of COVID, just aware that sense of anxiety, it felt like it intensified. Felt like like a lot of things that COVID seemed to me to sort of accelerate some of the things that were there before, and it's just sort of accelerated those. And I think our sense of anxiety about the church is part of that as well. And I suppose I think being involved in pioneer ministry for the years that I have, 16 years since I was licensed here in Poole, and I've learned a lot through that. I had very high expectations about what could be achieved in certain timeframes, and I see those timeframes being imposed, might be too strong a word, but certainly kind of brought to bear around other pioneers. And I think we as a church think it's possible to achieve a great deal in quite short timeframes. And so that creates a huge amount of pressure to be quite active and to sort of assert our agency, as the church, and increasingly, I think I was reflecting on our relationship with time as part of the issue there. That there's something fundamental about how we feel about, or how we inhabit time, and that we live in a culture that is deeply committed to sort of going faster and doing more, and perhaps we've been caught up by that. So those reflections, a lot of them were from some of the reading that I've been doing about my doctorate, began to sort of be in conversation with some of these thoughts about pioneering and the rural and the inherited. And I suppose the other thing that really provided the purpose for the writing was quite an autobiographical one, really, in that my mother rang me up about, must have been 6 or 7 years ago, so it's before COVID. She does ring me more often than that, by the way, but she rang me up that particular time and said, amongst other things, that the church in the village that I grew up in, it's a little village called Stour in North Dorset, had closed, or was closing, and the local vicar was looking to consult with the village and see what could be done, but it eventually closed. And I was really conscious of what an impact that would have on that village, where various other elements of kind of village life, social capital, have been lost over the years, and indeed in the years that we lived there. So there was it became personal to me, this sort of sense of anxiety that the church was in decline, and that this wasn't just about the church, but obviously about the impact on the wider community and the ability of the church to engage with the communities of which it's been a part for so long.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll revisit that. I think that's a lovely setting of the scene. Is there a piece from the book, Paul, that would do that? It'd be lovely to hear some pieces from it as we go through this evening. Would you read something for us?
Yeah, sure. So there's three what I call they are parables, I suppose, through the book that, and we could talk about this perhaps a bit more later, that kind of provide a slightly different perspective and a different way of addressing or engaging with some of these themes. So this is a parable, the first one in the book, called The Lighthouse. There was once a lighthouse that stood on a cliff above the shore. It was an important lighthouse, warning ships away from danger. It had stood on the cliff for as long as anyone could remember. However, the cliff was starting to erode and fall into the sea. Each winter storms came, and some of the cliff would be lost into the sea, and each year the storms got worse. And each year the edge of the cliff got closer to the lighthouse. So the people of the village got together and asked, "What shall we do? Soon the lighthouse will fall into the sea, and the lighthouse will be lost, and ships will not be safe." And some said, "The lighthouse has always been here. It will be here for years to come. Don't worry." And others said, "We will move the lighthouse brick by brick back from the edge of the cliff." And others said, "The lighthouse wasn't built to last forever. If you move the lighthouse, it will only last a few more years before you have to move it again." And some posed a different question to the people. If we let the lighthouse fall into the sea, what other ways are there of doing its job of warning ships away from danger? They argued that the storms were here to stay, the weather was getting worse, the erosion of the cliff was going to continue because the climate was changing. The argument raged on in the village, some taking one position and others another. A group was started with the aim of strengthening the cliff and preserving the lighthouse in its present position. Another group started a fundraising campaign to move the lighthouse in from the edge of the cliff. and a small number began talking to the sailors and the fishermen, asking them for creative solutions to the problem of how to know where the rocks are and how to avoid them. And the storms came, and the cliff continued to fall into the sea, and the edge of the cliff continued to get closer to the lighthouse.
Thank you very much. Like a lot of what you write, that piece had a strong sense of physicality and place, and there's an elemental sense in that. And Paul, as you know, place, the theology of place is a great interest of mine, and how the church engages with locality. And I'd love us just to explore that a little bit, if that's okay. And we've spoken about that, you and I, before, about the kind of rootedness of the Church of England, particularly in locality. What kind of relationship with place are you advocating or exploring, do you think, in the book? Just aware of the kind of the deep roots in locality. Are they a blessing? Are they a burden, or worse? What kind of connection to locality are you looking for, do you think?
I think ultimately place is really deeply important to us as human beings. And yet it feels like quite a sort of contested ideal, within the culture that we live in. And, perhaps to some extent a contested ideal within the church as well, in that, we can form social networks, we can form a world for ourselves in the digital space, and we can have very little, engagement or concern for the people that live around us. It's possible to do that in a way that would never have been possible, at another time in history. So there's this really interesting sort of, contested space around, how important is it for us to be people who are rooted in place. And it seems to me that Christian theology, is predisposed to have a deep value for place, for particularity, the incarnation, Jesus coming to a specific place, and that's a strength of Christianity. I think it's a strength of Anglicanism. I think Anglicanism, is one tradition that inhabits that deep value for place. But we're challenged by that. I think we're challenged with the conversation between place and space, which has a much less sort of sense of rootedness, much less kind of concern for history. It seems to me we're as a church struggling perhaps with that dynamic. But I think ultimately I would want to absolutely value place, and I personally think there's something prophetic about continuing to hang on and invest in and really value the importance of place, because ultimately for us to be connected with one another, connected to creation, and if to be human ultimately is about connection with one another, with creation and with God, then place I think is hugely important to that. So I the book is very positive about place, but you said in what ways might they be a curse? I suppose when we kind of idolize particular expressions of place, and that's where I suppose the idea, the concept of nostalgia, which I know you've written about, Andrew, can be an issue, can't it? That we're actually there's a kind of retrospective nostalgia about particular times and particular places, rather than a sort of unfolding inhabitation of place that is future orientated.
Which which brings us back to the idea of time again, doesn't it? It's so often about the attitude towards change, and what forms of faithfulness to locality can also anticipate or rehearse the place that is coming to us from the future, as well as being recalled. And in, for Christians, there is always that we're between those two poles, aren't we? The recalling and recovering the past events of our faith and salvation, and anticipating a coming kingdom. It makes for quite a complex, imaginative world for Christians, doesn't it? And I think more and more around the vital importance of what kind of imagination do we have as a church. And there's something there also around ecology. I know that the Church of England likes to speak. We like to speak in the Church of England around a mixed ecology of church forms, but actually in a broader sense, the church, if it's truly local, has got to be an ecology with its landscape, nature, human geography, society. That it's in connection with, deeply influenced by, and influencing to the ecology of the place in which it's set. And the way in which it does that, I think, is really important to recognise, often quite subtly. And that if it's a living thing like that, it surely has seasons of life. If the church is an organic thing, and this goes from its built heritage too. We might talk about church buildings in a little while, but I'd love to just explore the idea of whether there are, when it comes to thinking about church growth, what being a living thing, a living organism, means for growing. So sometimes, if being entirely honest, some writing that one reads around church growth is, or about congregational growth particularly, seems to overlook the fact that living things have seasons, and pushes almost for forced growth, like strawberries in December, almost a kind of consumerized supermarket approach to we must see fruitfulness, which of course is not how living things work. There are fallow seasons, there's winter and all the rest of it. I'd love to hear your thoughts around that. What do you think about the current season of church life that you perceive us to be in, and what does it ask of us? Any thoughts around that, and maybe from the book, likewise?
I mean, I agree. We do have a tremendous sort of, in our language, growth is such a, something that we seem to be, quite fixed upon. And I mean, a lot of my thinking, and it's not explicit in the book, but a lot of underneath it is a sense that we are exploring how to be a church in a secular age, but in a postmodern age. And I think modernity has had such a shaping influence on the church. And one of the shaping influences is this loss of the circularity of time.
Yeah. So
modernity turned time into a commodity. So it's something that can be used, and part of the consequences of that, it seems to me, is that we see time as a line rather than a cycle. And so all our graphs are up and to the right. It's about this constant sense that we can grow and progress. That's a deeply modern idea. And we are, I think, beginning to rediscover the importance of seasonality, but we're struggling with that. We find it hard to talk about the death of churches, for example. I've had those conversations in some of the things I've done around the book already, and in person, particularly, in a room, it's really hard to talk about that. And I think that is that sort of cultural legacy of just not being able to face, because there's a much deeper kind of resistance to that because of our relationship with time.
Yeah, and a real sense of loss, and of something I encounter very regularly is a sense of deep responsibility from those who have had the stewardship of the church passed down to them. There was an event recently where we were talking about the symbolism of church keys, and talking to a group of church officers, wardens mainly, who had nobody to pass the keys on to. Literally, physically, there's nobody who will take on the keys, and that the loss which comes from a profound sense of responsibility. Sorry, I'm cutting in. Is there
no, absolutely, and there is that sense, isn't there, of handing on the baton, and that deep, maybe it's an assumption, or certainly a hope and expectation that there'll be another generation to follow us on. I mean, I was listening to just made me think about this as I was thinking about this evening, a talk by Bishop Gooley, Bishop of Chelmsford, recently at the Festival of Preaching, and I think her perspective is really interesting because she's come from the Iranian church, and she's saying some very interesting things about our attention to growth and the valuing of growth in our language and in our strategy, which I think we really need to listen to, because I think she's quite a disruptive, not in a negative sense, you know what I mean, in a positive sense, quite an interesting voice. And talking about the fact that the church in Iran was decimated after the Islamic Revolution, and everything was stripped away, and yet a generation later or more, but certainly a generation later, extraordinary signs of spiritual hunger and people seeking, exploring faith in the church, or exploring what the Christian gospel has to offer. And quite a lot of Iranians coming to this country, and either they found faith and come to this country, or finding faith in this country. So I think again that kind of long view of time and the seasonality, and trusting that we serve the God of time, who holds time in his hands, and that can be trusted, and that those time frames are very often much longer than we can imagine.
Yes, and in the story of the church in particular places, there have likewise been times of serious loss and violent disturbance, and the Reformation is the obvious time to think of dissolution of monasteries.
Sure.
Periodically, kind of seismic, destructive events, and times of kind of real lapse away from the founding kind of impetus of our faith. But is there something you can read to us that would reckon with some of those things?
Well, I suppose I thought of reading this particularly with reference to we were talking about growth. I went to visit a church in Norwich called St Orban, which is led by a chap called David Lloyd, and it's just very interesting. He was involved in one of the resource churches in the centre of Norwich, and but has felt a call to explore, I suppose, doing church in a very different way. So first with St Albans, and then with a network of small churches called Garden Church, which is also a chapter about Garden Church in the book as well. But he started this new community in the building of St Albans, and they took the story of Orban as a kind of sort of shaping story for their community, because so Orban welcomed in a Christian priest fleeing persecution, and then he was so impressed by this priest's life and spirituality that he became a Christian himself. So there's this sort of flip narrative of the outsider welcoming the insider, and they kind of reflect that in their life as a community centered on this building. So I'll read a little bit from that. This story of a non-Christian, an outsider offering hospitality to an insider, flipping the common trope of Christian service, acted as a shaping story for the new community emerging at St Albans. It's a lovely image. the pagan, clothing himself in the clothes of the refugee priest, taking on a new identity, standing in bold defiance of the defenders of the prevailing culture. For the new St. Albans, this flipped narrative was expressed in creating a space within the building that attempted to blur the standard boundaries of church hospitality and service. It was seeking to create a space and build a mode of community that had space for dialogue and which took a more collaborative posture towards the wider community. I didn't want us to be afraid of letting go of a space, David tells me, illustrating their attempts to allow the space to be shaped by the community as much by the church. It's a picture of a community seeking to walk haphazardly in the wake of the Spirit, looking to break the mold of programs and rotas, flipping the lines of delivery drawn increasingly by the modern culture of activity, and looking to place the messy unpredictability of relationships with God and neighbour as the shaping value of Christian community. Behind the pebbled walls of a 19th century building, a building where the walls are dressed with material carried upstream from the edges of the world around, the horizontal made vertical, the outside a portal to the inside, a church is seeking to escape from the blueprint that might otherwise define it. There is a church waiting in spaces like St. Albans, a church that's urgently needed to provide a counterbalancing voice to the scripts of busyness and programmed activity, a church that can lay down paths towards a humanizing community with the grace and being of God at its heart, a church that is content with the wildness and unpredictability of the Spirit, a church that is attentive to the particularities of place, not flattening all the contours of history and context into the kind of cartographies of community that enable us to see only the things that we need for our own survival. A church that can reimagine the stories of its own inheritance as shaping narratives where the Spirit is still at play. A church that can see past, present, and future as facets of the fullness of God's time, in which the story of salvation is still being told, creating the church in its telling.
Well, there's loads there. Thank you. That's a really great example to choose, and one rooted in history, as you say. I love the way you talk about inside and outside, insider and outsider. It's something I've thought a lot about, thinking about the parish, the ideal of the parish as the kind of community for non-belongers idea. And you have this line in the book where you talk about, one of the bits I particularly like, where you emphasize that the church is not the star of the show. I can't remember if you use that phrase, but I love that, because one of my fears, I think, about certainly the Church of England is that in testing times and in time of rapid cultural change, the tendency can be towards sectarianism, and I fear the impact of sectarianism. I mean, within the institution, but also in terms of our posture to the world. How do you think new forms of church, as well as old, can resist that, or should we? Maybe you don't recognise that characterization, but how can, particularly for new expressions of church, not become too sect-like, if you see what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and just to take one step back, and I will answer that specific question. I think part of the reason for writing the book was a recognition of that tendency towards sectarianism and tribalism within the church, and that within this sort of environment where it feels like there's a lot of anxiety around and a concern about decline, which creates that anxiety. We sort of retreat into our silos and then broadcast our our particular solution for the problems of the church and what's going to fix that. And again, that seems to me quite a kind of modernist approach of saying, we've got a problem, and if we stand back far enough from it and look at and analyze it from our point of view, then we can fix it. And I suppose what I've tried to do is write a book that says, actually, the whole church is wrestling with what it means to be the church as we emerge out of modernism into this postmodern, secular, late modern, whatever you want to call it, this new age that seems to be deeply challenging for us as a church. And actually what we need is a conversation, and we need to tell stories, and I think we need to come at this at different angles that enable us to open up our imagination. So hence the parables, poetry, reflections, stories. Each chapter has got a sketch of the church where I went to visit the leader and interview them, and the beautiful drawings by a chap called Harry Taylor. And I think that actually lends something to the whole thing. He says you're reading a different kind of book here, I hope, and invites us into an imaginative, collaborative conversation rather than, I don't like this chap, he's not in my tribe. Do you know what I mean?
I love that. Because I found it one of the nice surprises of the book, that it was really nuanced around that. It was quite hard to place you in any particular kind of church camp, which I think is great.
I succeeded then, at least from my point of view. Yeah. Okay. But I guess to try and answer your question about new churches, particularly. I just think if the mixed ecology means anything, it means that need for collaboration and interrelationship with one another, that we need one another. We're finding out, aren't we, in terms of the ecology of forests, that where trees are communicating with each other through the mycelium of the fungi. I was drawn to this metaphor, as you can imagine, as a forager, but as a mushroom forager. But it's just fascinating, that so we're seeing forests not as a sort of collection of individual trees competing for resources, but as a collaborative, diverse ecology where trees and other plants are communicating with each other through the mycelium of the fungus in the ground. So you have this much more integrated sense of what an ecology is. So and in the same sense, I think we need to return to seeing the church as this diverse, collaborative ecology where we need each other. We need the diversity, and we need the conversation in the midst of that diversity. And I suppose one of the themes in the book is that I think one of the main kind of conversation partners, if you like, that we've lost, particularly in the Protestant tradition, is the monastic. And I think what we are beginning to see, and perhaps this is one element of what kind of season we're in, is a renewal of monasticism. So I found that I was hearing more and more, particularly after COVID, or after the lockdown period in particular, more and more people experimenting with small missional communities, small expressions of church that were drawing on the monastic. And it just seems to me that there's something we need to listen to there.
Yeah, let's talk about that a bit more, because I know you're keen to see simpler, more basic forms of Christian community drawing perhaps on the monastic ideal grow, and you're seeing those, you're cultivating them, you're working with them. I'm interested in that too, and I'm also, as you know, I'm interested in the way that church traditions of liturgy, of practice, our sacramental life are possible within that, and how which traditions hinder growth and which encourage it. Having just been preaching on the parable of the sower, I'm thinking a lot around this week about the growth of soil, the church as a kind of soil provider in providing the kind of context, the culture, literally the culture in which life and the common good too can grow, spiritual life in all forms. And I love the gift of deep soil provided by the historic church, of ancestors, of old prayers of buildings, like well-worn tools that you don't have to reinvent, that people can actually come into and feel that this is something I can inhabit and take my place as part of something. How can we become simpler, which I agree in many cases we need to become institutionally, particularly, also locally? How can we become simpler without losing that sense of the inherited practices that form and define what the church is? Huge question. Solve that in a couple of minutes.
Yeah, well, that would be nice. Read the whole book. That's what you need to do. No,
that's the answer.
Yeah, I mean, one of the communities that I go and see in the book and write a chapter on is a missional community in a place called Bardney, which is this little village in Lincolnshire. And it's an extraordinary story. Pete and Kath Atkins they felt called to this village, and they bought a barn and started to convert this barn. It was a medieval barn. And they had a surveyor come in to survey the foundations. And he basically said to them, the surveyor said to them, chances are we'll have to dig these foundations out and start again, because they would have been built on, very feeble foundations. And he started digging and basically said, you're all right. We've done the survey. You're going to be fine. And Pete, being Pete, wanted to know what was down there. So he started digging himself and started hauling out these big blocks of limestone. And it turns out that basically that barn was built on the foundations from a ruined monastery in the village.
Huh.
An extraordinary story. So they're starting this kind of reimagined monastery where they've got a rhythm of prayer and a community that meet to pray and live life in that village on the foundations of a monastery that was destroyed in the 9th century or something. And in the book, it seems to be that story, to come back to your question about tradition, was a story to reflect on that we are absolutely building on the foundations of tradition, and drawing from those treasures, and holding them up in a way that might be reimagined for the age that we're in. So trying to get down to the sort of essence and the relationships and the fundamentals of that monasticism and that tradition, in order that it can be sort of the dynamic equivalent of that can be reimagined perhaps in a simpler way.
Do you see places where that works well within the parish system? And the parish and the legacy of church buildings and so on is sometimes caricatured as institutionally quite heavy or complex. I think actually it's been extraordinarily adaptive over the centuries, because that's why we still have it partly.
Yeah.
Do you see examples of this kind of new growth working really well, mutually good within that kind of inheritance?
Yeah. Yeah, I do. I mean, I again go back to Pete and Kath Atkins and their communities up in Lincolnshire. They're not seeing themselves as this sort of new stream, out of relationship or ignoring what's gone on before. They're deeply in relationship with the other churches in the area and see themselves as, supportive and collaborative. And again, there's always, in the history of the church, there's always been this dynamic between the sodal and the modal, between the monastic, if you like, and the kind of more gathered diocesan expressions of church. And they're not like these sort of two competing or, different ways of being church, but mutually, complementary, dynamically complementary. And, I like that kind of element of reimagined monasticism seems to me to be quite exciting, because it's not like a new thing in some sense. It's there in the history of the church, and perhaps particularly in the Protestant tradition, we lost sight of that.
Yes, I'm sure that's true. Fascinating. There's so many directions one could take that in. I'm interested that you you end the book in Knowlton, I think, in Dorset, which is a place I also love, set within a Neolithic circle there. And that has, again, that sense of waves of reforming, reimagining that spiritual inheritance. And there's a historic church on the cover of the book. Interestingly, a historic church building that you visited recently, I believe. But you also write in the book that temples are a risk.
Yeah.
Really interesting. As the lead bishop for buildings on one of them, I thought that was an interesting phrase. What do you mean by that? And I mean, I don't disagree with you, because I think I've got an idea. But tell us what you meant by that. And has the Church of England perhaps become a bit too temple-like, or not temple-like enough? Or how do you feel about the temple?
Yeah, I mean, just to describe Knowlton a bit more, one of the things I find interesting about Knowlton, so like you say, there's these Neolithic rings, 2,500 millennia BC perhaps, and then a ruined church in the middle that's no longer consecrated for Christian worship, and then on the other side, in terms of from where you enter from the road, there's these two yew trees, and if you go to them, you'll see that they've sort of become this place of worship. They're lots of prayer ribbons and artifacts posted in the trees and prayers and that sort of thing. And I go there on a relatively regular basis. It happens to be on the road between here and Salisbury. And, it's not like that was a sort of one-off. It's been constantly used, the yew tree area. So, it kind of feels like that's almost like a microcosm of Christian history, or religious history, sorry, in Britain. And the church that looks like it's sort of at the center is actually at the edge.
Oh, love that.
So I suppose, that it's in that context that I talk about temples being a risk, in the sense that, as soon as we put a building in a place, we're putting a huge investment in that very particular place, which in the flow of time might well prove to be an incredibly good investment, if you like. But in the case of Knowlton, it clearly its investment, has been overtaken by the flow of time, the flow of history. So our discernment in terms of like investing in physical places is always going to be, to some extent, is always going to be provisional. We have to hold it provisionally. And that's what I think that's what I mean by temples being a risk.
Yeah, fascinating. It's interesting to see over time how church buildings can move from the centre to the margins of communities as the community changes around them.
Yeah.
And churches. I was talking today with somebody about church building that had become isolated by social change, would never be built there now, but then with new housing coming, is now finding itself at the center again. So having been in the center, then at the margins through plague or whatever it was, or just shift, and then so that move linearly is fascinating. I'm conscious of time, and we could gas about this for quite some time yet, I suspect, Paul. Thank you. Is there a piece that we can conclude with before we invite some questions and thoughts from those listeners?
Yeah, well, I thought I'd finish just by reading that bit on Knowlton, which ends the book. So, seeing as we've just been talking about it, so this is part of that final reflection on Knowlton Church. It's hard to look back at the church from this viewpoint and not see it as peripheral, irrelevant even, its walls disappearing slowly into the soil, its place at the centre dislodged. The edge might be the centre now, though what it's the centre of, no one is really quite sure. But while history, social change, and human endeavour place Christianity as the world view of the land, making a solid centre of a porous circle, the centre hasn't held. Spiritually, we are a galaxy of possibilities, a nova effect of searchings and questings into the wilds of the spiritual universe. Our buildings still inhabit the land. There are still flowers placed in the stillness of their sacred spaces, but on nearby trees the spirituality of secular Britain flutters in the breeze. I come to Knowlton now as a kind of spiritual discipline. I come to pray for the church in the county of my birth, the county in which I've now spent the majority of my life. I come to pray in the context of the spiritual reality of our age. And I come to pray in the context of time, deep time, prayers shaped in a place full of the relics of a pre-Christian past and the reality of a post-Christendom future. And I come to Knowlton to pray and put my own human endeavours in the perspective of the fullness of time, allowing the long, turbulent view of history to refine my hopes and dreams for the church. Places like Knowlton are painful, but important reminders that temples are a risk, a misadventure in time. Temples are an attempt to ignore the arrow of time to staunch the dynamic flow of history, and they place at risk that call to follow the Spirit into a world that has tilted once more around its temporary axis, and where the gravity at work on people's lives is drawing them away from, not toward, what was once perceived to be the centre. Places like Knowlton help us attend to the implicit variety of the church as it responds to the flow of time in a given place. Go back 600 years, argues Rowan Williams. You'd have monasteries of different kinds, you'd have enclosed orders, you'd have friars, the preaching orders, you'd have local guild churches and parish churches and chantry chapels and cathedrals and minsters, not just the parish church. And we've airbrushed that variety out of the picture. Places like Knowlton warn us against crystallising the church into any one form or expression. They keep us humble and yet hopeful, for where God by his Spirit has brought new expression to the form of the church, God will do so again. Knowlton and places like it also help me pray in the patient spirit of the early church. I'm reminded in this frantic, accelerating world that the arc of God's grace is long and bends towards the kingdom. Slowly, and not only slowly but mysteriously. There are few straight lines in the geometry of the church's history. This is the nature of story. A story we inhabit as patient witnesses to the person of Jesus who died and rose again in place and in time. A story we inhabit passionately but patiently, confident that God will fulfill his purposes in the fullness of time.
Beautiful, thank you. Thanks so much, Paul. We've got a bit of time now, friends. If there are any questions that you have, it's okay if you don't, but do you want to put them in the comments? If you'd like to put anything to, primarily to Paul, I can pick things up as well, but thoughts, reflections, questions? And if not, Paul, we can
just keep going.
We will have no difficulty continuing, and it might be that you or I have got questions for each other in the light of having read the book beyond what we've discussed. Is there anything that, while we're waiting for any comments that there might be, that you wanted to say around how the book could be, what you'd like for the book, your hopes for it, and how it might be useful for the church and beyond? Any reflections on that as we conclude?
Well, I suppose, like I was saying, deeply I have a deep value, I think, particularly through the work that I've done towards this doctorate around the importance of conversation and what conversation means, and that actually ecclesiology, how we find the church, how we understand the church is. Dan Hardy, who's a theologian that I'm particularly connecting with, talks about a moving ecclesiology, and again, I think we have this sort of slightly somewhat modernist tendency to like we're talking about the church as a fixed star. Well, ecclesiologically, I think we can do that. We think it's a sort of something we can systematize, whereas Dan Hardy understood the church as a dynamic in time and history and place. So conversation becomes really, really important. And actually, we discover what it means to be the church in a given time and place and context through our conversation. And so finding that art of conversation, that we can talk about the things that we find different about our approaches. Rather than, as we were talking about earlier, in the context of anxiety and in the context of, there's quite a lot of resources around actually within the Church of England. And so in some ways that increases anxiety because actually we have to compete for those resources. So we lose the conversation a little bit, you know what I mean? That's where I think we need to get as a church better, not just investing in the new or, reaching for resources that can address some of the anxieties that we feel, but also having that conversation and reflecting on what we're learning through that.
Yeah, that links nicely, I think, to what Lewis is asking in the chat about the kind of grieving conversation as well. Lewis asks, I wonder if you have any thoughts around how we can help some churches grieve as they move from one phase of life to another.
Yeah, I mean, I do reflect in the book about death and about lament and just how important that is in terms of reimagination. We can't find hope unless we're willing to face reality. Lament and it seems to me lament and renewal are not two different things. They're related to one another. So it's very hard for a church community to move. The structure of the book is lamentation, and then the second section is called waiting, and the third section is called resurrection. And whilst a lot of the themes around time and place sort of interweave between those three sections, and I talk particularly about missional community and monasticism in the third section, but it's not to say that once you get to the end of this, it's all going to be fine because there can be lots of missional communities. It's about recognizing that the journey that we're on is essentially a cruciform one of death, waiting, and resurrection, and it's the death bit that I think we struggle to hold. We struggle to be patient in that space, and face the reality that some of our churches are very, very fragile, and facing that possibility very, very, very clearly. Yeah.
It's such an important question, Lewis, and it's often, I think it's the fear of death, particularly in the churches that Paul has just described, is often at the heart of some of our other kind of anxious presenting symptoms as a church sometimes. And if we can have conversations about what matters to us most behind some of the presenting issues that often we spend time engaging with, about what we fear losing, what we urgently want to live, what we might need to recognize is no longer alive in the same way. And theologically, of course, there's so much there, but Good Friday is a hard day to be in church.
Sure.
It's a beautiful, profound, powerful, awful experience, and it is the part that instinctively and in its broader kind of embedding within life, we want to find a bypass around. But we do have an extraordinary narrative possibility that allows for patience. I think one of the other things that I think it's in what you've said too, Paul, is around patience. I talk a lot about that with church buildings, that we have quite a binary idea of we're either open, we're closed, we're here, we're not here. We might, need to wait for quite some time for the winter to be over, and things will grow again in a different way. And allowing patience. This is again one of the lovely things about the book: patience about what God might be preparing to do or teaching us to in the winter months, teaching us about in the winter months.
Yeah,
is so important. And actually, if we can take a slightly longer view of the future, then I think we find it a little easier to be less clenched about the difficult conversations in the present.
And it's interesting, the question is from Lewis. Lewis is one of the people I interviewed for the book, and he's a vicar in the middle of Dorset. And one of the churches that I went to see after I spoke to him was his tiny little church. Very remote sort of place, but it was interesting because I think in COVID it was very much like this church is going to have to close. There weren't the officers that could maintain the church. Very often it's the lack of people to do the work that he's doing, isn't it? But they've reimagined that space, and COVID was very much one of the generators of that reimagination. And I'm really interested in the impact of COVID in a positive sense. Obviously, it was a really tricky time for so many people, but it was a disruptor, wasn't it? And we couldn't carry on with business as usual, and so it opened up our imagination to do things in different ways. And in a sense, that was kind of like going through death and resurrection. It was, we couldn't carry on with the life that we had. So we had to stop. We had to wait. We had to reflect, and then we had to reimagine.
Thank you. That's a good note to end on. And whilst the time has immense possibilities creatively for the future, it's come to an end for us this evening, this hour. Paul, thank you so much for your engagement, and friends, do purchase and explore and use and share in the fullness of time. Josie's now modeling that for us. There it is. And thank you for your engagement and for listening, everyone, this evening and in the future as you pick it up. Let's keep the conversations going. But Paul, thank you very much indeed for this evening.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you. Just to say on behalf of Canterbury Press, thank you everybody for watching this evening. The link will be staying up on YouTube, so you're welcome to watch it again, or just send it freely to anyone you think might be interested. And I wouldn't be a salesperson if I didn't tell you that the book is on offer on Canterbury Press website until the end of Friday next week. So please do go check that out. But thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night, everybody.
All right.